Tonight we tell Wisconsin, we tell our country, and we tell people all across the globe that voters really do want leaders who stand up and make the tough decisions.
That is Republican Governor Scott Walker making his victory speech last night after winning a tough and bitter recall election. He beat Tom Barrett in the polls, which showed that about 54% of voters went for Walker, where only 45% went to his opponent, Tom Barrett, of course, a Democratic mayor from Milwaukee. Voter turnout was very heavy across the state. It was a closely watched election. As you can see the results right there, the 53% for Scott Walker, 46% to Tom Barrett, as many people went out to the polls to vote on this referendum of Scott Walker. But of course, he did emerge victorious. And we go to Doug Belkin in Chicago, who is joining us this morning with the latest. Of course, a lot of people saying that this election will have repercussions nationally. Doug, first, just tell us what you make of the overall results coming out of Wisconsin yesterday.
You know, it was surprising, and the polls had him at 7, but I think people thought it was going to be closer. So to come out, he obviously put a real stamp down. This is a big win for the governor.
And so when we look at the results coming in, you know, a lot of us who were watching it last night thought it would be a late night before it was announced. But in fact, he did emerge victorious with 53% of the vote here. What does this say now about how Wisconsin's thought about what was going on with his assault on the unions and the and really what this was about in terms of the state of Wisconsin?
I think this had a lot to do with property taxes. People's taxes went down for the first time in 14 years in Wisconsin. If you own a house there and you've seen your taxes creeping up every year again and again, maybe your pension's dried up, maybe your healthcare costs are going up, and your taxes are going up. And of course, you know what's happening with public employee folks who don't have to pay those things or didn't until last year. I think this was a reaction, a pocketbook reaction.
And what do you make of the fact that a lot of outside money flowed into Wisconsin during this election? A lot of people are taking a look at that and, again, deciding how that might play out nationally as we head into the November elections. Did a lot of people on the ground there talk to you about that? Were they concerned about a lot of the outside influence coming in?
Yeah, I mean, the recipe is pretty clear. Big money beats big labor. I mean, that's the takeaway. That's the short of what we can learn here. I think a lot of folks in Wisconsin felt like their state was hijacked by outside folks from one side or the other.
Yeah, $63 million was spent in this campaign. That's almost double that was spent in 2010 when Scott Walker came into office.
Yeah, I mean, the television sets in Wisconsin and the radio ads in Wisconsin didn't stop playing election advertisements for a month. It was wall to wall. You couldn't buy more. There was no more time to buy. It was completely saturated. Folks were getting a dozen calls and or a half dozen calls a day, you know, from the campaign. So this was a huge effort on both sides. But certainly, Mr. Walker had more money, and that showed in the end.
Yeah, and while campaigning for Tom Barrett, former President Bill Clinton said that a Walker victory would embolden those who wish to break unions. Of course, there are some fights raging across the country in other states. So how does this bode well for that? Does it change election strategy? Does it change strategy for a lot of these politicians going forward?
It's clearly going to embolden. There's a lot of Republican governors who took a look at this last night. They saw the dividends that Walker's aggression paid toward the unions. And that's going to have to factor into their decisions moving forward. In Michigan, in particular, I think that's a place to watch. I think the financial recipe here is also critical and a real thing that people are going to have to take a close watch from. You can't win a fight, you know, when you're outspent 6-1 or whatever it was.
Right. And, you know, if you believe exit polls, a lot of people are watching this morning an interesting fact that emerged that even though a lot of voters were voting for Scott Walker in this particular election, overall exit polls were showing that President Obama emerged ahead when asked if people would support him versus Mitt Romney in November. So an interesting dichotomy there. What is anyone making of those this morning?
You know, if you believe that this was a pocketbook election at its core, the economy is not horrible there. In Wisconsin, unemployment 6.7%. There is slow job growth. Walker got some credit for that. Obama, by the same token, probably going to get some credit for that. There's not a one-to-one relationship. Folks who supported Walker also supported Obama. But it's going to be a dogfight there. I think Jim Messina said this was the campaign manager for Obama, this was going to be a year ago, that they thought this would be in the win column. It's not as clear anymore. There's going to be a big fight there. This is going to be like Ohio, I think.
All right, Doug, thanks so much for joining us this morning with the update on this bitter recall election last night in Wisconsin. Thank you so much.